The relay station had been dead for 31 years. That was the number stenciled on the maintenance log bolted beside the airlock. The number Ensign Marcus Webb had memorized without meaning to. The way you memorize the birthday of someone you've never met. 31 years since Sentinel Station Kilo 9 had done anything but drift in high orbit above a moon nobody bothered naming. A rust-flecked relic from the nervous first decade after first contact, back when humanity built things out of fear and called it caution. Webb wasn't nervous about the silence anymore. He'd stopped being nervous about it 11 months into a 14-month rotation, right around the time the silence started to feel like company. So when the panel in front of him chirped, one short tone, polite, almost apologetic, he didn't move for a full 3 seconds. He just stared at it the way you'd stare at a photograph of someone dead who'd suddenly texted you back. "That's not possible," he said, to no one, because no one else was awake at 300 station time. He tapped the panel. The readout didn't blink or glitch or do any of the things equipment does when it's lying to you. It held steady, patient, certain of itself. Sentinel Core, status, dormant, standby. Standby wasn't dormant. Standby meant something somewhere had knocked. Webb's hand hovered over the comm switch to wake his co. Then he pulled it back. Regulations said report immediately. 11 months of silence said think first. He compromised the way people always compromise at 300. He logged it, flagged it low priority, and told himself he'd mention it at the morning briefing. He would be wrong about the low priority part for the rest of his life. 400 light-years away, in a chamber built to make small species feel appropriately small, Ellen Marsh straightened her sleeve for the 9th time in as many minutes and told herself it was because the fabric was cheap, not because her hands wouldn't stop finding things to do. She was the third-ranking translator on the Terran delegation, which was a polite way of saying she was the one they sent when the meeting wasn't supposed to matter. Trade quotas, shipping lane disputes, the kind of session where you sat behind the ambassador with a tablet and made sure nobody's idioms got mistranslated into declarations of war. This was not supposed to be one of those sessions where idioms mattered. The chamber of the Coalition Assembly rose around her in tiers the exact color of old bone, built to a scale that made every delegation feel like a child at an adult's dinner table. Every delegation except the Thren, whose seating section had been quietly expanded twice in the last decade to accommodate their honor guards, their staff, their sheer institutional confidence that they belonged at the head of any table they sat at. Ellen had learned to read a room in 3 languages and 11 species worth of body language, and right now every read she had was telling her the same thing. Something was different today. The usual pre-session murmur was thinner. Delegates who normally leaned toward each other to trade gossip sat upright, still, watching. She glanced at her ambassador. He was watching too, not the agenda, the Thren section. "They moved the ships," he said quietly, not looking at her. 3 carrier groups, Kessa Belt, overnight. Ellen's stomach found a new, colder floor to sit on. The Kessa Belt wasn't supposed to be on today's agenda. It wasn't supposed to be on anyone's agenda. It was 6 systems of rock and gas that had been jointly surveyed, jointly claimed, jointly nothing, for going on 4 years, ever since a human survey ship and a Thren survey ship had found it in the same fiscal quarter, and everyone agreed on paper to share. Paper, Ellen was learning in real time, was a very small thing to stand behind a fleet. The Thren delegate rose before the session had even formally opened, which was itself a violation of 11 separate procedural rules that nobody in the chamber was rude enough to point out. His name was Vos Kalen Thurn, third voice of the Thren Compact, and he had the kind of face that looked permanently amused by something you hadn't said yet. "Before the agenda," he said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "the Compact wishes to note a matter of resource security in the Kessa system. Effective this cycle, Thren forces will be assuming administrative oversight of the belt." No one in the chamber said anything, because everyone in the chamber understood exactly what administrative oversight, backed by 3 carrier groups, actually meant. Ellen's ambassador stood. The Kessa Belt is under joint survey status by treaty, any unilateral. Yes, Voss said pleasantly, the way you'd agree with a child who'd pointed out that the sky was indeed up. I've read the treaty. I've also read your species' history, Ambassador. Extensively, in fact. Fascinating reading. He turned, slow, unhurried, and let his gaze travel the tiers before it settled back on the human delegation. And Ellen understood, a half-second before he spoke, that everything that had happened up to this point in the session had just been the run-up to the only thing he'd actually come here to say. Your species built monuments to its dead instead of fleets to protect them, Voss said. You wrote treaties instead of writing borders. You have spent 40 years telling this assembly, in every session, in every white paper, in every quiet aside over drinks, that war is the thing you fear most in the universe. He spread his hands, almost kind. I respect that, truly. But respect is not the same as expecting you to act on it. So let us not pretend this is a negotiation. The belt is Thren administration as of today. I don't expect humanity to fight me for it. I don't believe humanity knows how anymore, not really. Not in a way that costs you something. The silence that followed had texture to it. Ellen could feel 300 delegates from 41 species doing the same math at the same moment, running the same simple equation. An insult, delivered on the floor, translated live into every language in the chamber and half the news feeds on a dozen worlds, and no response yet from the one delegation it had been aimed at. She looked without meaning to, at the human seat that mattered, not her ambassadors, but the 1-3 rows back, flanked by 2 aides and a Secret Service agent who did not blink, where President Alina Voss, no relation to the Thren delegate, a coincidence the news feeds would later spend absurd amounts of time on, sat with her hands folded on the desk in front of her, exactly as still as she'd been for the entire session. President Voss did not stand. She did not raise her hand for the floor. She did not, for 11 long seconds that the Assembly's own record would later timestamp with unusual precision, do anything at all. Voss Kalen Thurn, perhaps unsettled by a silence he hadn't accounted for, allowed himself a small addendum, the verbal equivalent of tapping a microphone to check if it was on. I say this without malice, Madam President. Only truth. Your people fear war more than any species in this chamber. That was when the president spoke, and Ellen would spend years afterward trying to describe the tone to people who hadn't heard it live, and failing every time because there was no anger in it, no heat. It was the voice of someone reading a measurement off an instrument. Do you know why we fear it? 4 words, no elaboration, no follow-up. The president let them sit in the air the way Voss had let his own insult sit, except where his had been a blade laid gently on the table. Hers landed like a door closing somewhere very far away and very final. Voss opened his mouth to clarify, to press, to fill a silence that had suddenly, inexplicably, become his problem instead of hers, and found that he had nothing ready. He hadn't prepared for the question to be handed back to him. He had prepared for shame or bargaining, or the particular flavor of diplomatic groveling that species do when they've been caught believing their own propaganda about themselves. He had not prepared for a woman who looked, for all the world, like she already knew the answer and was simply waiting to see whether he did. Ellen's tablet had stopped registering her hand. She realized distantly that she'd forgotten to breathe. Somewhere in that pause, unrecorded, unremarked, a data packet no larger than a heartbeat traveling through relays that hadn't carried a live signal in 3 decades. A station in high orbit above an unnamed moon finished its diagnostic cycle and quietly, patiently, began waking its neighbors. The clip hit the news feeds 9 minutes after the session ended, which in the current media environment counted as a geological age. By the time it had been dissected, captioned, sped up, slowed down, and set to 4 different pieces of dramatic music by people who had never once had to sit in a room and watch a Thren delegate try to annex 6 systems by press conference. The phrase had already outrun the moment that produced it. Do you know why we fear it? 4 words, President Voss's face perfectly still, and somehow that stillness had done more damage to the Thren Compact's messaging in 11 seconds than a decade of trade sanctions. In the White House press office, this was not being experienced as a triumph. She didn't say anything, Deputy Communications Director Priya Nkemelu said, for what felt like the 40th time, to a room of people who kept acting like repetition would eventually make the sentence untrue. That's the whole clip. 4 words and a stare. I have 3 networks asking me to confirm whether this represents a declaration of war, and I don't know what to tell them because nothing was declared. Tell them it wasn't a declaration, said Feldman from Legislative Affairs, not looking up from his own screen, where he appeared to be reading the same 6 words scrolling past on a live feed of a platform Priya refused to open on her personal time. Tell them it was a question. It's trending as a threat. It's trending as several asterisk things, Feldman said. Give it an hour. He turned his screen around mostly, Priya suspected, because he could no longer keep the delight off his own face and needed someone else to share the burden of it. The image was a still from the session, the president's hands folded, that flat, unreadable expression, captioned, in the confident all caps of someone who had never once worked in crisis communications. And why mom when I ask if I can go to the party? It had 400,000 shares. It was climbing. That is not helping, Priya said, and heard how unconvincing she sounded even as she said it, because it was, in fact, helping. Some strange alchemy of the internet had decided the moment was less an act of state and more a vibe. And vibes, it turned out, were easier for the average person to rally behind than an 11-paragraph explainer on the Kessa Belt Survey Treaty of 4 years prior. Down the hall, a National Security Council staffer named Dario Alvarez was on his 3rd cup of coffee, and his 2nd attempt at drafting an official statement that managed to say absolutely nothing new while sounding like it said everything. He deleted the phrase asterisk measured response twice, because it made the president sound like a thermostat. He deleted stands ready to defend, because it sounded like the opening line of a movie trailer for a movie that hadn't been approved by legal. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister, who worked retail in Ohio and had exactly 0 security clearance and exactly the right instincts. Is this the start of a war law? He typed back, no asterisk. He deleted it, typed, I really hope not. Deleted that too. Sat there a long moment with his thumbs over the screen the way a man sits over a chessboard when he's already lost and hasn't told his opponent yet, and finally sent, ask me again next week. 3 floors up, in a room with better furniture and worse lighting, the president was not watching any of this. She was standing at a window that looked out over a lawn she had crossed maybe 400 times in her life, and had genuinely seen, really seen, perhaps a dozen of those times, and this was shaping up to be one of the dozen. Her chief of staff, a quiet, competent man named Warren Ake, who had learned early in his tenure that the president's silences were data and not vacancies to be filled, stood a respectful distance behind her and said nothing at all. On the side table by the window, there was a photograph in a frame that had traveled with her from house to house, office to office, for 30 years. Not a formal portrait, nothing staged, just a young man in fatigues on a beach somewhere with a haircut that dated the image to a war fought before most of the correspondents currently hammering out think pieces about her had been born. Her father, 20 years old in that photograph. 23 when it stopped mattering what he looked like, because the ship he was on took a hit in a strait most people couldn't find on a map. And there was a folded flag in a closet upstairs that the president had not opened in longer than she wanted to admit. She did not explain any of this to Ape. She had never explained it to anyone who worked for her, not really, not the actual weight of it, only the fact of it, the biography line that appeared in every profile. Father, veteran, killed in service. 3 words that did the same thing to a life that, do you know why we fear it, had just done to a summit, said almost nothing, and left the listener to fill in a silence that turned out to be enormous. She had grown up in a house with one framed photograph and one folded flag, and a mother who did not cry where anyone could see her, and had learned, long before she learned anything about policy or diplomacy or the correct way to hold a room, that the people who talked most confidently about war were, without exception, the people who had never had to fold a flag in a closet they couldn't bring themselves to open. She had learned something else too, later. In briefings she wasn't supposed to remember this vividly, that the years right after first contact, the frightened years, the years everyone now looked back on as almost quaint, had produced more than treaties and disarmament summits and monuments. They had produced contingencies. Buried, funded, forgotten by design. The way a family keeps a fire extinguisher in a house that's never burned down. Not because they expect to need it, but because the year they built it was the year they'd looked at the numbers on what a war with something they didn't understand yet could cost, and decided that fear, properly used, was not the same thing as weakness. She had signed off on maintaining those contingencies, quietly, once, 3 years into her first term, and had not thought about them since with anything more than the passive awareness a person has of a smoke detector they trust to be working. "Ma'am," Ape's voice careful, "General Akafor is requesting 5 minutes, says it's time sensitive." The president did not turn from the window immediately. "Is it about the Thren fleet movements?" "No, ma'am." A pause and something in it made her finally turn around, because Ape did not do pauses like that without reason. "It's about Kilo 9. She did not recognize the designation for a full second, and then she did, and something in her chest went very still and very cold in a way that had nothing to do with anger. General Adiz Akafor came in without the usual preamble, which told the president more than the words that followed it. Akafor was a woman who believed deeply in preamble, in giving a principal time to arrange their face before the substance arrived. She skipped it now. "Ma'am, at approximately 300 relay time, Sentinel Station Kilo 9 registered a status change from dormant to standby, unscheduled, unauthorized. No command signal was sent from this end." Which means either there's a fault in a system that hasn't faulted in 31 years. On the same day the Thren moved 3 carrier groups into the Kessa belt, Akafor said, or the network is doing exactly what it was built to do, and it doesn't need us to tell it when that time has come. The president looked, for one unguarded second, at the photograph on the side table, the boy on the beach who never got old, and then back at Akafor. And whatever was in her face in that moment was gone before Ape could fully read it, filed away behind the same composure that had sat, hands folded, through 11 seconds of silence in front of 41 species. "Show me," she said. 400 light-years away, in a modest, unglamorous office belonging to a modest, unglamorous species that had spent the last 2 decades doing exactly what modest, unglamorous species do best, surviving by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. An Asheville trade liaison named Beit Dalan Kesh was starring at a sensor log he did not want to be starring at. "Run it again," he told his assistant, not because he doubted the instrument, but because some part of him was still hoping the instrument would develop a sense of mercy. It did not. The log showed 6 separate objects across the Kessa approach corridor, objects the Asheville's own decades-old survey data had cheerfully catalogued as debris, as dead relay hardware, as the kind of forgettable orbital litter every system accumulates, each one now registering a very small, very deliberate increase in power signature. Not weapons fire, not even weapons charge, not yet, just a network clearing its throat. Bait had liaised with humans for 11 years. He had eaten their strange bread at their strange holidays, had watched them argue passionately about sports scores and gently, almost apologetically, about war. He did not believe, the way the Thren seemed to believe, that this made them soft. He believed, watching 6 dead systems wake up on a screen in perfect, patient synchrony, that it had simply never before been necessary for anyone to find out what they were. He reached for the comm to warn his counterparts in 3 other delegations, and found, with the specific dread of a man watching a slow-moving disaster from exactly close enough to see it clearly and exactly too far to stop it, that he did not know yet what words to use that wouldn't sound like panic. The Situation Room smelled like burnt coffee, and the particular tension of people trying not to look at each other while they waited for a screen to finish loading. General HFY pulled up the network map on the main display, and the president watched 6 points of light bloom across a stretch of space she had, until this morning, thought of only as a line item in a defense budget she'd signed without reading past the summary page. Kilo 9 through Kilo 14, HFY said. 6 stations, seated across the Kessa approach corridor and 2 adjacent systems during the Cordell administration. Cataloged externally as derelict relay hardware, decommissioned survey equipment, orbital debris. That was the point. Nobody was supposed to look twice. And internally, the president asked. Internally, they're the Sentinel Doctrine, distributed deterrence network. No offensive capability, I want to be very clear about that, ma'am. This isn't a hidden strike fleet. It's retaliatory only. Each station is dormant until it detects a specific threshold of hostile action against a human asset, at which point it wakes, verifies, and if the threshold is met and sustained, it responds. Automatically. No human hand on it once it's live. Sustained how long? Built-in delay window. Long enough for someone to stop it. That was deliberate too. Whoever designed this didn't want a system that reacted to a single provocation. They wanted one that reacted to a pattern. HFY's jaw tightened. The concern, ma'am, is that we didn't authorize the wake cycle. Something in the network read the Thren fleet movement into Kessa as the start of that pattern before we ever gave an order. The president looked at the 6 blinking points for a long moment. It made the call itself. It made the call we told it to make 31 years ago and never got around to untelling it, HFY said. That's not a malfunction, ma'am. That's a promise nobody remembered we made. 400 light-years away, Bait Dahlin Kesh's sensor officer, a nervous, overachieving Asheville named Fiern Adek Voss, no relation to anyone. A coincidence he would later find far less funny than everyone around him seemed to had run the same diagnostic 6 times, and was now on his 7th, because the alternative to running it a 7th time was accepting what the first 6 had already told him. It's a calibration fault, Fiern said to Bait, to the room, to the universe generally. It has to be. Those signatures have been dead for decades. Dead things do not power up. That is a foundational premise of my entire field. Fiern. I'm saying the instrument is compromised. I'm saying there was a solar event, a data corruption, something in the relay chain. Fiern. Because if I am not saying that, then what I am looking at is 6 independent weapons platforms the humans have had parked in our shipping corridor for 3 decades that we cataloged as asterisk garbage. And I would like it on the record that I personally signed off on that catalog entry in year 4 of my post, and I would like it further on the record that I am now going to be sick. Fiern, Bait said, not unkindly, run the diagnostic on yourself instead. I need you calm, not correct. Fiern stared at him. Then, with the particular dignity of a professional choosing his moment to fall apart later in private, he closed his mouth, straightened his collar, and said, in a voice only slightly higher than his usual register, "Understood. Recalibrating myself. Give me a moment." Bait almost smiled. He didn't have time to. The comm panel lit with an incoming priority channel, and the voice on the other end belonged to someone he'd hoped he would not be hearing from today. Thren High Command did not, in fact, know what its own fleet commander was doing. This was the piece nobody outside a very small circle of Thren officials understood yet, and it was the piece that was about to matter more than anything Fearn's instruments had picked up. Fleet Commander Dreeth Corin Vass, 3 carrier groups, a service record 30 years long, and a private, unspoken conviction that the compact civilian leadership had gone soft on doctrine the same way. In his estimation, humanity had gone soft on everything, had moved on Kessa a full 18 hours before his own government's authorization had cleared. He had told himself this was initiative. He had told his staff it was initiative. He had used the word so many times in the last day that it had started to sound, even to him, like something he was building out of spare parts to cover a hole. The truth, which he had not said aloud to anyone, was smaller and uglier than initiative. Vas Kalen Thurn's speech in the assembly had been beautiful, had been correct, had said everything Dreeth himself believed about humanity's exhausted, sentimental relationship with war, and Dreeth had watched a human woman answer it with 4 words and a silence, and had felt, for one humiliating second, something that a Thren fleet commander was never, under any circumstances, supposed to feel in the presence of a species that cried at war memorials. He had felt outmatched. He had responded to that feeling the way men like Dreeth had always responded to it, in every species, in every century, by deciding that the correction for humiliation was force, applied quickly, before anyone, including himself, had time to examine the feeling too closely. Commander, his communications officer, young, careful, Compact Council is requesting an immediate status report. They are asking pointed questions about authorization timelines. Tell the Council their commander is securing a contested asset in accordance with standing doctrine, Dreeth said. Sir, with respect, standing doctrine requires civilian. I am aware of what standing doctrine requires, Lieutenant. Dreeth did not raise his voice. He had learned that trick from watching the human broadcast, he realized, with a discomfort he buried immediately. I am also aware that a human outpost sits at the edge of this corridor, staffed by fewer than 40 personnel, defended by nothing more than a single aging cruiser that has not fired its weapons outside of training exercises in a decade. This is not an act of war, Lieutenant. This is a demonstration. We will move a carrier group within visual range of that outpost. We will hold position, and we will let the humans understand precisely how much force stands between their sentiment and their survival. No shots. A demonstration only. Sir, execute the maneuver. The outpost was called Harrow Point, and it had exactly the staffing and the aging cruiser that Dreeth's intelligence had described, and exactly none of the awareness that it was about to become the most important 6 square kilometers of empty space in human history. Corporal Denise Aconquires was on watch when the sensors lit up, and her first thought, a thought she would be asked about in a debrief for the rest of her career, was that the readings had to be wrong, because nothing that large was supposed to be able to get that close without triggering a dozen earlier warnings first. Station, this is watch. I have 3 carrier-class contacts bearing. She read the numbers off twice to make sure her own voice hadn't scrambled them, inside visual range. They are not hailing. The outpost's commanding officer, a tired, decent man named Captain Idris Whitfield, who had spent most of his career believing his post would never see anything more dramatic than a supply delay, came onto the deck already reaching for a channel that connected, eventually, through 6 relays and 1 very anxious duty officer, to a situation room 400 light-years away, where a general and a president were still looking at 6 blinking points of light on a map. They're not firing, Whitfield said, mostly to himself, watching the shapes resolve on the main display, close enough now that the cruiser's own sensors could pick out individual running lights along their hulls. They're just sitting there. That was the demonstration Dreeth had promised his own doubts. Position, patience, the silent arithmetic of overwhelming force, parked close enough to be understood without a single weapon discharged. It held for 4 minutes. In the 5th minute, Whether through the ordinary friction of 30 carriers worth of crews holding position under a commander they privately suspected had exceeded his orders, or through the specific bad luck that attends every historical turning point. One of Dreith's escort vessels drifted correction thrusters first 11 degrees closer to Harrow Point than its holding pattern called for, and its targeting array active, as targeting arrays are during any demonstration. Because a demonstration with disarmed weapons is not a demonstration at all, swept, for 1.5 seconds, directly across the hull of Captain Whitfield's aging cruiser. It was almost certainly an accident. It would be argued, for years afterward, in tribunals and after-action reports, and at least one furious closed session of the Compact Council, that it was definitely an accident, an artifact of formation drift and nothing more. It did not matter what it was. 400 light-years away and 31 years in the making, a network that had been told once, a long time ago, to watch for exactly this: sustained hostile posture, weapons-active contact, against a human asset, past the threshold, past the delay window, past every chance anyone had been given to stop it, finished the last second of its patience. On Captain Whitfield's bridge, every alarm the cruiser possessed went off at once, and half a dozen more that he did not know his ship possessed went off a half-second after that, originating from a source his systems couldn't immediately identify. 6 points of light waking in perfect synchrony along a corridor everyone had assumed was empty. In the Situation Room, General Ockaffer's display, which had shown 6 patient, blinking, standby markers for the last several hours, flickered, and every single one of them turned red. The room did not erupt. That was the strange thing Ake would remember afterward. No one shouted, no one knocked over a chair, because everyone in the Situation Room had spent their careers training for exactly this kind of moment. And training, it turned out, mostly just meant that panic arrived quieter and better organized. "Talk to me," the president said. "Threshold breach confirmed across all 6 kilo stations," Ockaffer said, reading off a feed that was updating faster than she could speak it. "Weapons-active hostile contact against a designated human asset, sustained past the delay window. The network has moved from standby to engage pending. 90 seconds to weapons release." Pending on what? Pending on nobody stopping it. The president was already moving toward the comm station before Ockaffer finished the sentence, because there was, in fact, exactly one thing worse than a war nobody had chosen, and that was a war that started because the people who built the off switch had forgotten where they put it. Harrow Point had 90 seconds too, and Captain Idris Whitfield spent the first 10 of them simply trying to understand what his ship was telling him. "That's not us," he said to his XO to the deck to no one. "Those firing solutions, that's not our cruiser. We don't have targeting locks on anything. Where is that coming from?" "Sir, it's external," his tactical officer said, voice climbing. 6 external platforms, they've gone active there, sir. They're resolving firing solutions on all 3 carrier groups simultaneously. This isn't coming from us. I don't have authorization codes for any of this." "Then whose is it?" Nobody answered, because everybody on that bridge who'd been in the service more than a decade had heard the old stories. The ones that got told in messes and simulators like ghost stories. The rumor of something seeded during the frightened years after first contact. Something nobody official ever confirmed. Something you weren't supposed to need, and therefore weren't supposed to think about. And every one of them was now doing the same math at the same time, arriving at the same impossible answer. And none of them wanted to be the one to say it out loud first. Whitfield said it instead, quietly, mostly to himself. "Oh," he said, "it's real." On Dreith's flagship, the first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong was not an alarm. It was silence, his own tactical officer going very still at her station, the particular stillness of someone who has just seen a number that cannot be argued with. "Commander, We have 6 unknown platforms resolving weapons locks on all carrier groups. Point of origin, she hesitated, and Dreeth understood, with the sick clarity of a man watching his own decision arrive at its destination without him, that the hesitation was worse than any number she could have given him. Point of origin is catalog debris, sir. The stations we surveyed as derelict. That is not possible. I am reading it as possible, sir, because it is currently happening. Dreeth had built his entire career on a single conviction. That force, applied with confidence, was the only language every species in the galaxy ultimately understood, humans included, and that the appearance of hesitation was itself a kind of surrender. He had believed this so completely that he had moved a fleet on a contested asset 18 hours ahead of his own government's authorization, certain that results would excuse the timeline. He had not built any part of his career around what to do in the 90 seconds before an automated response system. He hadn't known existed finished deciding whether his 3 carrier groups were about to become debris themselves. Compact Council override, he said. Now, I want every channel open. I want it known this was a demonstration, unarmed intent I want. Sir, there isn't a channel for that. It's not listening to hails. It's not a person. Back at Harrow Point, in the 40th second of 90, Corporal Denise Aconquires did something that would earn her a commendation she'd spend the rest of her life feeling faintly uncomfortable accepting, because at the time it hadn't felt like heroism. It had felt like the only thing left to try. Sir, she said to Whitfield, the old manuals, the ones from the original station build, the ones nobody's opened since the retrofit, there's a legacy override protocol. It's not in the current systems. It's not supposed to still exist. But if this thing really is what I think it was built by people who were scared enough to make sure it could still be stopped by hand. Whitfield looked at her for exactly 1 second, which was 1 second he did not have to spare, and said, "Do it." It took her 31 of the remaining 50 seconds to find the sequence, hands shaking in a way she would later be embarrassed by, and everyone else would consider the single sanest reaction in that entire engagement. Keying in a manual interrupt that hadn't been tested, hadn't been maintained, existed only because 31 years earlier someone paranoid and careful had insisted that no automated system, however well designed, should ever be beyond a human hand's reach. 19 seconds left when the interrupt registered. 14 when the 6 red markers on Akafar's display flickered, actually hesitated, the machine equivalent of a held breath, and dropped back from engage pending to a new status. Neither Akafar nor anyone in that room had a protocol memorized for, because it had never been reached before. Hold, awaiting human confirmation. It's asking us, Akafar said, something in her voice that hadn't been there a minute before. Ma'am, it found a way to stop and it's asking us what to do next. The president did not hesitate the way Akafar had. Confirm hold. Full stand down of the network pending my direct order. Nobody re-engages that system without my voice authorization. Do you understand me, General? Yes, ma'am. Get me a channel to the Thren Fleet Commander, now. It was not, in the end, Dreeth who answered that channel. The Thren Compact Council, watching the same catastrophe unfold on its own instruments 400 light-years from a corridor its own fleet commander had moved into without authorization, had reached its own decision in roughly the same 90 seconds, arriving at it through the particular clarity that comes from watching someone else's ambition put your entire civilian government's neck within reach of a weapon they hadn't known existed. This is Second Voice Illith Corin Vane speaking for the Compact Council, said the voice that came through when the president's channel connected, not Dreeth, not even Voss Kalen Thurn, but someone with more authority than either of them and considerably less patience. Madam President, I am given to understand that Fleet Commander Vass's positioning at Harrow Point was not sanctioned by this council. Your commander parked 3 carrier groups on top of an outpost of 40 people and let a targeting array sweep an active weapons lock across their hull, the president said. I don't particularly care whose fault the paperwork is. No, Vane said, and something in the way he said it told her he meant it. I imagine you don't. For what it is worth, Commander Vass is being relieved of his command as we speak, on this channel, so that your government has no doubt the compact considers his actions his own. There was a pause, and Illith Corin Vane's voice, when it came again, had lost the careful formality of a moment before. Madam President, I have spent the last 4 minutes learning that your species maintains a distributed retaliatory network capable of resolving simultaneous firing solutions on 3 carrier groups from platforms we cataloged, in good faith, as debris. I would like to understand with respect, and I say this as someone whose entire fleet was 19 seconds from becoming wreckage, exactly how long that network has existed. Long enough, the president said, that I'd hoped never to have to tell you about it this way. Dreeth, still on his own bridge, still technically in command for the handful of seconds it would take his relief to arrive, said nothing at all, because there was nothing left in his conviction about the universal language of force that had survived the last 90 seconds intact, and a man who has just watched his certainty die does not, as a rule, have anything worth saying. The president closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, the only visible sign, in that entire exchange, of what those 90 seconds had cost her personally, and thought, unbidden, of a boy on a beach who never got old, and of a flag folded in a closet she still hadn't opened, and of how very close the universe had just come to needing a second one. Then she opened her eyes, and her voice, when she spoke again, was as level as it had been in the assembly chamber that morning. Second voice Vane, I think it's time we talked. Assembly reconvened 4 days later, and this time Ellen Marsh did not need to read the room to know something had changed. She could feel it in the seating itself, the Thren section noticeably smaller, its honor guard reduced, Voss Kalen Thurn present but seated 1 row back from where he'd stood 4 days earlier with a certainty that had not survived the intervening 96 hours. The president had asked for the floor this time. That, too, was different. She had not been summoned to answer for anything. She had requested the chance to speak, and the distinction was not lost on a chamber that dealt daily in the difference between being made to explain yourself and choosing to. She stood at the same podium Voss Kalen Thurn had spoken from, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned 4 days ago, more viscerally than any briefing had ever taught her, exactly how much could be carried in a voice that didn't rise. 4 days ago, she said, a delegate in this chamber told me that my people fear war more than any species present. He wasn't wrong. I want to start by saying that plainly, because I think this assembly has spent the last 4 days assuming I stood up today to argue with him, and I didn't. I stood up to finish answering his question, because I don't believe I finished it in time. She let that sit for exactly as long as she'd let the silence sit 4 days earlier, and this time nobody mistook it for weakness. We fear war because we have already had it, not with any of you, with ourselves. Twice, in the span of 1 human lifetime, we organized the whole of our industry, the whole of our science, the whole of our youth, toward the project of killing each other more efficiently than the time before. We got very good at it. We built weapons in the Second War that could end a city in the time it takes to finish this sentence. And by the middle of the century after that, we had built enough of them, aimed carefully enough at each other, to end the species twice over and still have warheads left. She paused, not for effect, but because some sentences require a breath before you can say them plainly. For 45 years, 2 of our nations held those weapons pointed at each other, ready, tested, real, and did not use them. Not because the will to survive isn't strong in us, because we learned at a cost I don't think this chamber can fully price, that some tools are only worth having if you can hold them your entire life and never once decide today is the day. That is not the absence of strength. It is strength that has learned what it costs and chosen, every day since, to keep paying the smaller price instead of the larger one. 96 hours ago, a network we built during the most frightened decade of our history, built by people who remembered exactly what I've just described to you, and who did not trust that fear alone would be believed, came within 19 seconds of making a decision none of us wanted it to make, because a fleet commander from another delegation decided my species' well-known aversion to war meant we could be tested without consequence. She looked briefly toward the Thren section, not at Voss Kalen Thurn, but past him, at the empty seat where Dreeth Corin Vass would have sat had his own government not relieved him of the chance. He was testing a fear. What he found instead was a promise. We do not build monuments instead of fleets, third voice. We build monuments because we already know exactly what the fleets cost, and we have decided, generation after generation, to keep paying for the monuments instead of paying for the war. That decision has a limit. 96 hours ago, the limit was 19 seconds away, and it was a 23-year-old corporal who talks to her mother twice a week who found the reach to hold it back. Not any system, not any doctrine, a person, choosing restraint in the middle of the only 90 seconds in the last 3 decades when restraint was the harder option. She let that land too. So to answer your question fully, 4 days late, we fear war because, unlike most of you, we have already lost the argument about whether we could survive it, and only barely won the second argument about whether we deserve to. Do not mistake that fear for softness again. It very nearly cost all of us something none of us could have taken back. There was no applause. Applause would have been the wrong register for what had just been said, and the assembly, whatever else could be said of it, understood register. What happened instead was quieter and, in its way, more absolute. Species after species, delegation after delegation, simply stopped looking at the Thren section, the particular diplomatic cruelty of an entire room deciding, without a vote, whose side history had just proven correct. 400 light-years away, in an unremarkable archival office belonging to the Coalition Species Registry, an aging clerical AI named Ordinal 7, who had cataloged 941 sentient species over a service life longer than most of them had existed as spacefaring civilizations, opened humanity's file for a routine update, and found that the standard entry species disposition, conflict-averse, historically demilitarized, low first strike probability, no longer matched anything in the last week's incident logs. Ordinal 7 did not have emotions, strictly speaking, but it had developed, over several centuries of cataloging, something functionally identical to dry amusement, and it allowed itself a moment of that now as it typed the revision. Species disposition, revise, conflict-averse remains accurate, demilitarized, strike entry replaced with deterrence postured, historically reluctant, empirically capable. First strike probability, unchanged, remains negligible. Retaliatory response threshold, revise from unknown to narrower than previously assumed, do not test. It paused over the closing field, the one reserved for a single-line summary that appeared at the top of every species record, the line every diplomat in the coalition skimmed before a first meeting. The old line had read, "Handle with patience. Species' response to provocation is slow and largely rhetorical." Ordinal 7 deleted it, considered several replacements with the patience of something that had genuinely never been in a hurry in its long service life, and settled, finally, on handle with respect. Species has survived its own worst impulses twice and built the discipline to remember the cost. Provoke only if prepared to discover exactly how well they remember it. It filed the update and moved on to the next species in its queue, which had considerably less interesting news that week. On Earth, 3 days after the assembly session, in a small town in a state few of her staff could have found unprompted, President Alina Voss stood alone at a wall of names, having asked, for the first time in 4 years, that the press pool keep its distance and its cameras down. There was no ceremony to it. She had not announced the visit. She found the name she was looking for not difficult. She had found it 100 times before. Her fingers knew the path across the granite without her eyes needing to guide them. And she stood there for a while in the ordinary quiet of a memorial on a weekday afternoon. No music, no speech, nothing that would translate into a clip anyone could caption. She touched the name once, the way you'd touch a door you weren't planning to open, just confirming it was still there, still solid, still exactly what it had always been. 19 seconds, she said, to no one, to the wall, to a boy who had been 23 years old for longer now than he had ever been alive. We had 19 seconds to spare. I wanted you to know that. She stayed a while longer, and then she left, and the flag in the closet upstairs remained folded, and would likely remain folded for the rest of her life, because some things you carry precisely by not opening them, and she had made her peace with that particular arithmetic a very long time ago. 400 light-years distant, in the same archival office, in the same unhurried service life, Ordinal 7's Q chimed with a new entry. A routine ping from a monitoring station in a system it had never before flagged as active, requesting classification for a signal pattern that did not match anything in 31 years of Sentinel doctrine documentation, originating from a station designation that did not appear on General Acaffer's map. In a sector the Cordell administration's declassified files did not mention at all. It was, by every available record, a 7th station, one nobody currently serving had authorized, inherited, or been told existed. In the Situation Room, when the alert reached her desk 2 hours later, President Alina Voss read the designation twice, set the report down very carefully on the exact center of her desk, and did not, for a long moment, say anything at all. If you made it this far, drop a comment telling us which chapter hit hardest and subscribe, because that 7th station isn't staying quiet for long.